I kept my hands perfectly still. That was the hardest part. Not letting them see me tremble. It was a Tuesday morning in October, the kind where the light comes through the kitchen windows at a low angle and makes everything look golden and warm, like something out of a painting. I remember thinking how strange it was that the world could look so beautiful at the exact moment it was falling apart. My son-in-law was standing at the head of my kitchen table, my table, the one my husband built by hand in 1987, and he was talking about selling my house. Not asking, talking, like it was already decided. I set my coffee cup down slowly and looked at him. He didn't look back. He was staring at the papers in front of him, shuffling them with the confident, careless energy of someone who has never once doubted that the world would arrange itself around his needs. My daughter sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth, her hands folded in her lap. I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "You heard me, Mom." He had started calling me Mom about 2 years in. I never asked him to. I looked at my daughter. She still wouldn't look up, and I thought, I should have done this differently. I should have seen it coming. But when your child needs help, you don't think about protection. You think about love. You think about the fact that she's your little girl and she's struggling and the door is right there, and how could you close it? I was wrong to think that way, and I know that now. But I want you to understand, I was wrong for the right reasons. Let me go back to the beginning. My name is Dorothy, and I am 68 years old. I have lived in this house for 31 years. My husband, Gerald, and I bought it together in the spring of 1994, when my daughter was just 4 years old and the neighborhood still had more dogs than cars. Gerald passed away 7 years ago from a heart attack that came without warning on a Saturday afternoon while he was raking leaves in the backyard. One moment he was there. The next moment he wasn't. After he died, the house became something different. It stopped being just a place and started being the last solid thing I had. Every corner of it held something of him. The kitchen table he built, the bookshelves he painted, the slight scuff on the baseboard in the hallway where he bumped the moving dolly the day we carried in our first couch. I could not have sold that house any more than I could have sold a piece of myself. My daughter, Renee, had grown into a bright, warm-hearted woman who unfortunately had a pattern of choosing men who made her life harder than it needed to be. Her first marriage ended quickly and quietly. Her second, to a man named Marcus, lasted longer. Marcus was charming in a way that I recognized but couldn't quite name when they first got together. It's the kind of charm that fills a room and then slowly empties it. They had been married 4 years when the financial trouble started. Marcus had invested money, their savings, it turned out, and more into a business venture that failed in a way that left them not just broke, but in debt. They lost their apartment. They lost their car. Renee called me on a Wednesday night, crying in a way I hadn't heard since she was a teenager, and asked if they could stay with me for a little while. Of course, I said. Because what else do you say? That was 3 years ago. In those 3 years, I watched my home change in small ways that I kept telling myself didn't matter. Marcus rearranged the living room furniture without asking because he said the layout wasn't functional. He replaced the curtains in the guest room because he didn't like the pattern. He started having work calls at the kitchen table during the hours I usually had my breakfast. So I began eating in my bedroom. Small things. Separately, they were nothing. Together, they were something I couldn't quite name, but felt every single day. My daughter helped around the house and was kind to me. Mostly. But she had a way of deferring to Marcus in everything. A habit so deep I think she'd forgotten it was a habit. If I said something he disagreed with, she would go quiet and look at her hands. That silence, over 3 years, said more to me than most conversations ever could. I paid all the bills. They paid nothing. Marcus said they were getting back on their feet, and I believed him for longer than I should have. Eventually, I stopped asking about a timeline. My neighbor and closest friend, Beverly, lived 2 houses down, and had known me for 22 years. She had watched all of this from a careful distance, the way a good friend does when she knows you need to make your own mistakes. She brought me casseroles. Did is. She sat with me on my porch on Sunday afternoons. She never said I told you so about anything, ever, which is why I trusted her completely. Dorothy. She said to me once, about a year in, "Do you know what the deed to this house says?" I looked at her. "Of course I do. My name." "Good," she said, and changed the subject. I didn't understand why she asked. I do now. The change came on a Monday in September when Marcus received a phone call from a lawyer in Phoenix. His uncle, a man named Robert, whom Marcus had mentioned exactly twice in 3 years of living in my home, had died and left an estate valued at approximately $1.4 million. Marcus was the sole beneficiary. I found out about the inheritance the way I found out about most things involving Marcus. Second-hand, late, and only partially. Renee told me at dinner that evening, quietly, while Marcus was on the phone in the living room. Her voice was careful. Her eyes were bright in a way that worried me. "That's significant," I said. "Yes," she said. "Now they'll be able to get their own place," I said. She looked down at her fork and said, "We'll see." That was all. "We'll see." It took Marcus 4 days to show his hand. I've thought about those 4 days many times since. What he was planning, how he was arranging things in his mind, building the argument, deciding on the angle. Because what he did next wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate. On that Tuesday morning, he came downstairs before I was fully awake, made himself coffee in my kitchen, spread papers on my table, and waited for me to come down. When I did, he gestured to the chair across from him like he was a banker and I was applying for something. I sat. I didn't know what else to do. Renee came down a few minutes later. She sat beside him, but not close to him, and she poured herself coffee and stared at the tablecloth. She had known this was coming. She had not warned me. Marcus explained his plan with the pleasant confidence of someone delivering good news. The inheritance, he said, gave him the capital to finally make a real investment. He had identified a property developer he wanted to partner with. He needed liquidity, and since he and Renee had been living here, contributing to the household, he used that phrase without a trace of irony. He felt it was fair to consider this house a shared asset, particularly given that my daughter was family. He wanted to sell the house. He had already looked up the estimated market value. He even had a figure in mind for what he thought my share would be after costs, which he had written at the bottom of one of the pages and now pushed across the table toward me like a settlement offer. I looked at the number. I looked at my kitchen. I looked at the scuff on the baseboard I could see from where I was sitting. And I thought of Gerald raking leaves on a Saturday afternoon. "This is my house," I said. "Technically," Marcus said, "but family." "This is my house," I said again. My voice was steady. I didn't know how. "My name is on the deed. My husband built that table. I have lived here for 31 years, and you have lived here for 3 years without paying a single bill." Marcus's expression changed. The pleasant confidence didn't disappear, it just shifted into something colder. "We need to have an adult conversation about what's fair," he said. "I am having it," I said. He leaned forward. He told me that if I wasn't willing to be reasonable, he would look into his options. He said that in 3 years of residency, in a house where he had made contributions, the curtains, the rearranged furniture, apparently these now counted as equity. There were legal frameworks that could apply. He said he had already spoken with someone. I want to be honest with you about what happened inside me in that moment. Because it wasn't anger. Not exactly. It was something colder and quieter. It was the specific feeling of recognizing something you should have recognized much sooner. It was embarrassment and grief. and a kind of exhausted clarity, all arriving at the same time. I looked at my daughter one more time. She was looking at her coffee cup. I said, "I need to think." And I stood up, took my coffee, and went to call Beverly. Beverly answered on the second ring, the way she always does. I told her everything in one long, controlled sentence. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dorothy, do you have everything organized? Your deed? Gerald's will? All of it? In the fireproof box?" I said, "Under the bed, the way Gerald always kept it." "Good," she said. "Don't touch anything. Don't agree to anything. I'm calling my nephew." Beverly's nephew, as it happened, was a real estate attorney named Daniel, who had been practicing for 18 years and had heard variations of this story before. He came to Beverly's house that same afternoon, and I walked down the street with my fireproof box under my arm, feeling like I was carrying something sacred, which I suppose I was. I want to say here what I should have said earlier. I was not without fault in this situation. I let it go on too long. I watched my home being slowly rearranged and said nothing because I didn't want to cause conflict, because she was my daughter, because I kept hoping it would resolve itself. That is not wisdom. That is avoidance. And I think, if I'm going to tell this story honestly, I owe you that part of it too. But here is what I had. Here is what I had carried for 31 years in a gray metal box under a bed. The deed to the house, in my name alone. Gerald and I had discussed putting both names on it, and we had decided against it for estate planning reasons that a friend had recommended at the time. My name, only my name. Gerald's will, notarized and witnessed, leaving the house and its contents entirely to me, with clear language about that intention. And something else. Something I hadn't thought about in years, but which Daniel held up and read slowly, twice, before setting it down with a particular look on his face. A document Gerald had asked me to sign 2 years before he died, which I barely remembered, in which I had affirmed sole ownership of the property and agreed to certain protections against any future claims from occupants without ownership interest. Gerald had been a quiet man, but a careful one. He had, apparently, thought about things I had never thought to think about. Daniel read through everything. He asked me questions. He took notes. Then he folded his hands on Beverly's kitchen table and told me exactly where I stood. No one had any claim to my house, not legal, not equitable. Renee was my daughter, and I loved her. But love is not the same as property law. Marcus had contributed nothing financially and had no written agreement, no lease, no legal standing of any kind. His mention of legal frameworks was, Daniel said, the kind of vague threat people make when they are hoping the other person doesn't know better. I asked Daniel if he was certain. He said, "Mrs. Dorothy, this is one of the cleaner cases I've seen in a while." I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked what I needed to do. He told me. I went home that evening, made dinner, and said nothing. The next morning I was up before anyone else. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, Gerald's table, and waited. Marcus came down first, same as before, and I saw him register that something was different before he could identify what. Maybe it was my posture. Maybe it was the way I looked at him when he walked in. Not with the careful politeness I had trained myself into over 3 years. Just directly, the way you look at something you've already decided about. He sat down. He said, "Have you thought about what we discussed?" I said, "I have." He said, "And?" I said, "I want you both out of my house by the end of the month. I have spoken with an attorney. I understand my rights completely. If you'd like, your attorney can speak with mine. And we can save everyone a great deal of time by confirming what I already know, which is that neither of you has any legal claim to this property, and any attempt to assert otherwise will not end in your favor. I put Daniel's business card on the table between us. The silence was something I could feel. Marcus stared at the card. He started to say something about reasonableness, about family, about the fact that his wife, my daughter, deserved. My daughter, I said, is welcome to speak with me privately at any time. You are not my family in the way that grants you access to my home or my property. You are my son-in-law. You are a guest who has stayed past the invitation, and I would like you to leave. Renee had come downstairs. I don't know when. She was standing in the doorway in her bathrobe, holding her arms around herself. I looked at her for a long moment. I said, I love you. That has never changed, and it won't. But I need to know that you knew what he was planning. She didn't say anything, which was its own answer. I won't pretend that didn't hurt. It did. It hurt in a way that's different from being hurt by a stranger. The kind of hurt that doesn't announce itself loudly, but just sits there, steady and permanent, like a change in weather. I said, I think we all need some time. I went upstairs and started making calls. Daniel handled the formal communication. There is not much to tell about the legal process because there wasn't much of one. Marcus made some noise for about 2 weeks. He sent a letter through someone he described as his attorney, but who turned out to be a paralegal at a general practice firm, who sent one vague response and then went quiet after Daniel replied. That was the end of it. They moved out on a Friday. 23 days after that Tuesday morning, Marcus loaded their things into a rented truck with the efficient anger of someone who wants you to see how inconvenienced he is. Renee carried boxes quietly. Before she got into the truck, she stood at the end of the driveway for a moment. I was at the window. I didn't go out. I watched her stand there, and I thought about all the years of her, the 4-year-old who would fall asleep in the car and have to be carried inside, the teenager who cried over things that seemed enormous and turned out to be small, the woman she had become who was currently standing on a driveway, choosing between her mother and her husband. She looked at the house for a long time. Then she got into the truck. They drove away. I stood at the window until the street was quiet again. Beverly called 20 minutes later. Are you all right? She asked. I don't know yet, I said. I think so. I will be. Come down for dinner, she said. I did. We ate pasta and talked about things that had nothing to do with any of this, and somewhere around 8 o'clock, I felt something ease in my chest that had been tight for a very long time. Not happiness. Exactly. Not yet. But the specific relief of a situation that has resolved itself in the direction of truth. Here is what I know now that I want to say out loud, because I think it's the part that matters. I blamed myself for a while. I should have set boundaries earlier. I should have had a formal agreement from the beginning. I should have trusted Beverly's quiet question about the deed instead of filing it away without really hearing it. These are true things, and I own them. But I also know this. Letting someone into your home because you love them is not a mistake. It becomes a mistake when you stop paying attention to what's happening inside your own walls, when you confuse love with permission, when you stay quiet about things that matter because you're afraid of what speaking up might cost you. That is the lesson I paid 31 years of equity to learn. My house is my home again. Gerald's table is still here, and the bookshelves he painted, and the scuff on the baseboard in the hallway. On Sunday mornings, I eat breakfast at the kitchen table with the light coming in at whatever angle it feels like, and I don't move for anyone. Renee called me 6 weeks later on a Sunday evening in December. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't known the full extent of what Marcus had planned until the night before that Tuesday, and that when she found out, she hadn't known what to do, which I told her was not the same as doing nothing. She said she knew. She cried. I cried too. She also told me something she hadn't mentioned before. She told me that Marcus had received his inheritance money, the full $1.4 million, and had transferred most of it into a separate account she didn't have access to before she'd even known the full amount. She had found this out from the lawyer she'd consulted when she started thinking about her own options. He had been hiding the real total from her, the house scheme, the pressure, the talk of investments. None of it had ever been about getting back on their feet. It had been about control, about having enough to walk away cleanly and leaving her with nothing. I sat with that for a long time. I told her she could come for dinner whenever she was ready. I told her she was always my daughter, and the door was open in the way that it should have been from the start, with love, but with clarity, with warmth, but with an understanding that love between adults requires honesty in both directions, and that she would need to be honest with me the way she hadn't been on that Tuesday morning. She said, "I know, Mom. I know." She came for dinner the following Sunday. We ate at Gerald's table, and I made the roast chicken she had always loved since she was small, and we talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing. There were moments that were hard and moments that were easy, and the proportions weren't quite right yet, but they were getting there. I think that's the most honest ending I can give you. Not perfectly resolved, not all tied up, just moving in the right direction, which is, I have come to believe, all any of us can really ask for. I am 68 years old. I own my home. I know exactly whose name is on the deed. And on Sunday mornings, the light comes through the kitchen windows and makes everything look golden. I sit at my husband's table, and I hold my coffee with both hands, and I let it.